Welcome to Healthy Minds. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein. Everyone is touched by psychiatric conditions, either themselves or a loved one. Do not suffer in silence. With help, there is hope. Today on Healthy Minds, many of the people, not all, but many of the people who end up in the situation of being homeless have a psychiatric condition that may be untreated or undertreated.
Well, on any given night in our country, about 550,000 Americans are either out on the street or in shelters. And of those 550,000, about 2/3 are homeless individuals. That is, they're not in a family. And 1/3, of course, are in family situations. And I think the tragic aspect of the problem is that of those 2/3 of the 550,000 people, many of them are out on the street.
And for many of the chronically homeless individuals who never got the help that they needed when their symptoms started to occur, and their lives turned into a life of homelessness for maybe years or even decades.
That's today on Healthy Minds. This program is brought to you in part by the American Psychiatric Association Foundation, the John and Polly Sparks Foundation, and the New York State Office of Mental Health. Welcome to Healthy Minds. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein. Today we focus on the issue of homelessness and the relationship between mental illness, homelessness, and what can be done to solve this problem. I speak with leading experts Philip Mangano, the president of the American Roundtable to Abolish Homelessness, and Todd Lipka, the CEO of Step Up. Philip, Todd, thank you for joining us today. I want to jump right in to talking about the homeless situation and really start off with the scope of the problem. So Philip, tell us the big picture.
Well, on any given night in our country, about 550,000 Americans are either out on the street or in shelters. And of those 550,000, about 2/3 are homeless individuals. That is, they're not in a family. And 1/3, of course, are in family situations. And I think the tragic aspect of the problem is that of those 2/3 of the 550,000 people, many of them are out on the street. The number of unsheltered people in our country has actually risen over the last several years. So I think many of your viewers will be seeing more people on their city streets, and that's part of the unfolding tragedy that's going on in our country.
Many of the people, not all, but many of the people who end up in the situation of being homeless have a psychiatric condition that may be untreated or undertreated. And I'd like to ask about that aspect of the situation.
So when you look at that entire homeless population, broadly speaking, probably about 20% of those individuals have significant disabilities, whether it's mental illness or chronic health issues, substance abuse, or a confluence of 2 or 3 of those factors. Those individuals, that 20% of the population, and they tend to be what the federal government calls chronically homeless. That is, they've been on the street longer. The federal government defines that as a year or more, but it's a very broad category because you're chronic if you've been on the street for a year and if you've been on the street for 40 years. And it's not a homogeneous group. So those individuals, because of their disability, they're going to need probably long-term support. That is, housing combined with support services to aid them in their disability. But the unfortunate fact of the matter is the mental health system is really a system built to provide services within 4 walls. And for many of the chronically homeless individuals who never got the help that they needed when their symptoms started to occur, and their lives turned into a life of homelessness for maybe years or even decades, the system has failed them in terms of getting the services to them. But what we do know is that when you go out into the street, you provide not only mental health services, but all the other services combined with housing, that these individuals largely succeed in housing and finding recovery in their lives.
So I want to ask you about the program that you've initiated and are leading in terms of helping in communities to fight homelessness. What do you do?
Well, we combine what's known to work, which is permanent supportive housing, which is housing. So for that 20% who are suffering from mental illness or other disabilities, we know that they need a home. And it used to be the mental health system thought, oh, well, let somebody recover and then they'll be housing ready. But in fact, what we know is housing should be the foundation of recovery, not the culmination of recovery. And in fact,
it's hard to imagine getting better from any condition if you don't have a place to live.
Because you're spending 100% of your energy just surviving. So you or I or anybody else, if we were in that same situation, we would not have a quality of life that would enable us to recover, particularly if you have a mental illness. So housing becomes the foundation for that support. And what you do is you infuse that housing with rich supportive services. You don't say to that person, well, you need to go down to the clinic all the time to get help. We bring the services into the home and work with each individual on what is their goal plan. And what we find is that usually it takes 3 to 12 months, but people need to unlearn their survival skills from the street because those are not very helpful in housing. And that many of these individuals, because they became alienated from their families because of their mental illness, and then their lives on the street, they acquired all these survival skills. Like we had one man who, once he moved into housing, he would scream at 2 o'clock in the morning at the top of his lungs. And most landlords would want to kick that person out because that's very antisocial behavior. But we knew that that was his mechanism for staying safe on the street. Because if you scream, people stay away from you and you're safe. So we helped him understand, oh, you can lock your door. That's your mechanism for staying
You're
safe.
safe now. You're in a safe place now.
Yeah, yeah. And so making sure that all those services are going into the home and helping the individual say, okay, now that I don't have to spend all my energy just simply surviving, what do I want my life to be about now? A part-time job, volunteer work, hobbies, social networks. So reestablishing goals for that person and partnering with them to help them achieve what they want in their life.
You know, Jeff, what you said was it's hard to imagine somebody really getting stable in their life without a place to live. Yet for many, many years, the federal policy on this issue was that you would care for a person, provide them with services without regard to actually housing them. And it's only in recent years, in the last 15 years or so, where housing first has become part of the policy, that programs like Todd's really have revolutionized how we approach people who have mental illness and many other people. And so your intuition, which seems so commonsensical, how can you really get stable in your life unless you have a stable place to live? Yet that was for a quarter of a century not part of policy around homelessness. So sometimes what is commonsensical doesn't quite make it into government policy.
And has a tremendous effect on the results and the problems that arise.
Exactly. And in fact, what happens when we provide housing without services, for example, people have a hard time making it because the services that they need to support their tendencies aren't there. And when they fall out, we tend to blame the person as opposed to the failure of the policy itself. We remember that from deinstitutionalization many, many years ago. The failure of deinstitutionalization was people were placed in housing, but without the community supports that they needed. And what Todd and what Step Up are doing and what Housing First advocates for is that people need to be in housing with the appropriate support services. They will flourish in that situation. So we've moved from a situation where the actual person was being blamed for the failure of the policy to an appropriate policy which provides both housing and service. Services without housing leaves people on the street. Housing without services sets people up for failure. When you put those two together, you've got something that works. And Todd's kind of program, what is your retention rate now?
96%.
With some of the most difficult people that we would pass by and we'd think a blanket and a bowl of soup is the best that we'll ever do for that person. They're now living in housing and flourishing in that housing. And 95, 96% is not an unexpected return on the investments that are being made.
So think about that. 'Cause what Philip's saying, underlying that, is a very important assumption, which is to say that instead of, for somebody who's disabled with a mental disability, asking them to advocate through a system, that somebody who's well has difficulty managing. It's really saying, let's put the individual in the center of that universe and revolve those services around that person. They're the center. But the traditional system is the person revolves around the mental health system, trying to intersect at various places to get help. And we know that really doesn't work. When we put that person in the center and say, this is housing with services that are aligned with your goals of what you want to do. Because a lot of people say, well, God, we've housed people 30 or 40 years of homelessness with serious mental illness who have been very successful in housing. Most people would walk past them and say, oh, God, they'll never succeed. But the fact of the matter is the system has been so resistant to them, they've given up hope after years of neglect or false promises or getting help that really wasn't what they really wanted. And if you or I were on the street, we would, living disappointment after disappointment, we would have given up hope too. It's a very normal response to that situation, to feel hopeless and then to set up your own sort of barriers so that you're not disappointed in your life. Just like that man who would scream at night. You set up your barriers to keep people away because you've been disappointed. But once you can say to the person, no, I'm going to partner with you about what you want to achieve, not what I think you need, but let's talk about what you want in your life. And when you talk to most homeless people, even with serious mental illness, they want housing. They don't want to live out on the street. But they won't say that or they won't act like that because that's not even in their frame of reference.
They don't think it's going to happen.
And it hasn't for them. You see people 40 years on the street.
What should a person do if they have a loved one who, maybe because of untreated mental illness, is homeless? How can a person help their loved one in that situation?
Well, I think first is they can get help themselves. And we know that NAMI, which is a national organization, has support groups throughout the country. And at NAMI.org, you can find local chapters. I think also to stay in touch with your loved one and try and channel them or provide support to get them to services. Really be encouraging, and maybe as I heard one psychologist say, love the individual and hate the illness. So recognizing that maybe they're going to have to move at their own speed, but to stay connected to that person and let them know you care about them and you're concerned about them and you're there when they want to get help. But it's very challenging for many families because they have to watch. I've talked with many families. It's killing for them to watch their son or daughter or brother or sister or mother or father decompensate to the point that they lose everything and they're out on the street and there's really nothing
and they won't
that they can do.
accept help.
I think fortunately, the very kind of program that Todd is talking about, which is shaped around housing first, which is, if it's anything, it's consumer-centric. You start with the consumer, and then you build everything out from the consumer, as Todd was indicating. For many, many years, we talked to the provider agencies, what they thought a person needed. We're now much more consumer-oriented. That's something that we brought to Washington, the simple idea that it's a business principle. You start with the customer and the consumer, find out what they want. And what we discover about homeless people with mental illness, they never ask for a pill, a program, or a protocol. They ask for one thing, a place to live, shockingly. And so the good news, I think, for people who are confronted with the situation that you described is that these programs now exist pretty much all across our country. That innovative idea, which was resisted initially, we have to service them, and they have to get ready for housing. The notion that people should go into housing, and within the context of housing, that's the most important service, and then you wrap the other services that you need around that housing. Well, that's pretty much spread all across our country, so there's much more hope than there's ever been for people who have mental illness who are out on the street. In fact, our most innovative ideas in homelessness, the greatest achievements in homelessness, the highest percentage of retention are specifically for that population. That's how much Housing First and programs like Todd's have impacted in the arena of homelessness.
What Philip said is very true, but unfortunately also in most urban areas, the need or the demand far outstrips the supply. So I would also say that for family members, advocating with those local organizations who do have the resources, and that takes research, but it's not that difficult to find out where are the mental health agencies, where are the housing resources, and to advocate for your loved one so that the finite resources, maybe you can, using your own advocacy, get directed towards your loved one, and that they can be included where those are resources.
So go to, if there is in your community or the community that your loved one is living, services available, you as a family member go there and advocate for your loved one to try to get them to bring them in, to pull them under their wing to help them.
And the good news, I'd say the good news on that is there's now a technology, so to speak. There's now an initiative that if you advocate and your loved one is in that initiative, the result is stability and security in a loving environment in which they can live. That's something that couldn't be said 20 years ago. There was no next step in that regard, especially in the wake of deinstitutionalization, where we just removed housing from the equation totally. Now that's back with the appropriate services. So it's very hopeful, I think, for people who have loved ones and for people who are just out on the street without having loved ones. There's an equal opportunity for them to resume a much more normal life.
What should someone do? And we all walk by people who are homeless, and we see them, we may feel sorry for them, but we really end up walking by. What should a person do? Is there some step that individual citizens can do for a stranger who may be in need? What do you do?
Well, I think this is a very personal decision. From my perspective, the HIN, or the Homeless Information Network, is a very efficient communication system. So homeless people talk with each other to find out where are resources, feeding programs, showers, where are good places to sleep. That is a very effective system of communication. So in many urban areas, the need for food, or other needs are not as strong as people may think. And oftentimes someone who is looking for a handout of some kind, you never know where that's going to go. I say the most important thing you can do is to acknowledge that that's an individual, not shun away from them, because there's so much stigma from others that someone gets that they internalize that stigma. And I think the most important thing you can do is recognize that that's an individual, not a homeless individual, not defined by their homelessness or their mental illness, but they're an individual, and that they have the respect of acknowledgement. The emotional pain of being homeless, along with the symptoms, are worse than anything else. So I think just acknowledgement is fundamentally the most important thing you can give somebody.
I think that just ties in with things that we know in our general culture. Social capital, that is, having relationships with people, having family, having institutions we belong to, having a church or a synagogue or a mosque that we belong to, that social capital that you have often cushions you from the vagaries of life. One thing we know about homeless people is that most of their social capital, if not all of it, is exhausted. They don't have a family to go to, they haven't belonged to an institution, or they no longer belong to an institution. So with that diminution of social capital, their life gets much more riskier, and many people fall into homelessness where they have no social capital. So it's part of our work in homelessness is to restore social capital to people, to establish relationships with them, to put them in a situation where they can establish new relationships, because that begins to resume the creation of human esteem and well-being in the person. So I think Todd is absolutely right that acknowledging the person, talking to them. I've discovered that giving money, there's absolutely not one shred of evidence that indicates that randomly giving money to homeless people helps them. There is a lot of evidence that indicates that investing money in programs like Todd's and other programs, that makes a big difference in those lives. So I'd say the random giving of resources, that's much less important than creating some kind of dialogue, a conversation with that person, helping them to understand how important and resuming social capital is in their life.
Because that contribution of food or money, you never know where that's going to go, no matter what somebody says. And it may go to things that actually perpetuate them in a state of homelessness.
And I can just say on that, in my work in Washington, one of the things I did, I was always on the road because there's an old axiom in Washington, any day out of Washington, that's a good day. So I was constantly traveling in the country. And one of the things I did in every city was I looked at their death list. Why were people dying on the street? Never once did I see a homeless person had died of starvation, ever. So food resources are pretty readily available in most communities. It's the socialization resource that actually is much more important. That's a donation that people can make in terms of just communicating with and being present to a homeless person.
So what do you say? You're walking by a homeless person and they say, can I have $1 for a cup of coffee or something? What is the response that's most appropriate?
I would look them in the eye and say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't do that. May say, how are you doing today? Just to acknowledge it's a real exchange. And it's not, when someone is asking you for something, it sort of sets a tone that you are better than that individual and they're not as good as you. And it perpetuates this idea that this individual is the other. They're not the same as me. They are somehow different than I am. And I think acknowledging they are no different than I am, and that we are the same as individuals who have difficulties, challenges, assets, strengths, and that their homeless status does not define them as a person. And I think many homeless people, seriously mentally ill, have said the belief that we had in supporting them was essential to their recovery, is that we didn't define them by their disability or their state of homelessness.
The other thing I would say on that is one of the things that we discover when we're just in a relaxed conversational place with homeless people in a program is that they're very up on current events, actually. Most people stereotype homeless people, they think they're oblivious to what's going on. But in fact, a conversation with a homeless person isn't that difficult. It might be about the ball game that happened last night, their favorite team or a favorite team in that particular city, or other kinds of current events. What do you think of what the president did yesterday? What about this or that? They're quite conversational in that regard if you approach them that way. If you approach them out of some stereotypical viewpoint that they're probably not cognizant of what's going on, that they're in another place, then conversation is very difficult, but it's much easier than one would expect.
What do you say when you're reaching out to help a person get housing first and the support services? What do you say to them?
Well, it's about engaging them from where they are. So you need to be sensitive to what their situation is. You need to respect their boundaries, whatever those are. You need to be credible and genuine, and you need to be consistent. Many homeless people have talked about, oh, I had somebody from an agency come to see me one day and promise they're going to help me, and I never saw them again. So we have to know that there's probably a relationship to the length of time someone's been homeless, to their resistance, and their suspicion that you are not really who you say you are and that you're not really going to provide help. So I think to be consistent over time, do exactly what you say you're going to do. Be thoughtful about where is that person and what do I need to think about to respect them, just as if you're approaching anybody else on the street. You make an assessment of what their situation is and how can I accommodate that. But from the beginning, it's what Philip said, is you're talking about, well, what's important to you? When you approach a homeless individual who smells and maybe needs a change of clothes, you may say, well, gosh, you need a shower, you need a change of clothes, but that's what we think they need. Let's talk about, well, what's important to you?
What do you need?
What do you want? And let me help you, let me work with you to get what you want to succeed.
What I would say on that too, and I'm sure you'll agree, sometimes it's less important what you say than what your affect and what your energy is. If you approach the person and acknowledge them and treat them appropriately, and you have good affect and you have good energy toward that person, all of the words are less important, but then they become more substantial as you go on to identify options for that person. So affect and energy, I think they're very important in terms of the engagement process.
I want to thank both of you for the work that you've been doing, for coming here and sharing this important information. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
As individuals and as a society, we need to help our most vulnerable people. People who experience homelessness have the potential, with assistance, to live full, productive, healthy lives. We need to do more, because with help, there is hope. Do not suffer in silence. With help, there is hope. This program is brought to you in part by the American Psychiatric Association Foundation, the John and Polly Sparks Foundation, and the New York State Office of Mental Health. Remember, with help, there is hope. Until next time, I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein.